Ronald Reagan was an American politician who served as the 40th President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. A member of the Republican Party, he previously served as the 33rd Governor of California from 1967 to 1975 after a career as a Hollywood actor and union leader. Ronald Reagan focused on peace through strength for the U.S., which means the United States would have peace if we had a strong military. Reagan spends up to $1.5 billion in build-up for his military, from military employees to troops, weaponry, and even other nuclear stuff. The huge downside of Reagan's build-up is the USSR goes bankrupt due to trying to keep up the same energy of the US. But this was all a part of Reagan's plan, which became a huge success for him and the US. Although this created a lot of jobs for our government and military. The next thing is the Reagan Doctrine, which is the idea that the U.S. would support guerrilla groups fighting to overthrow communist and pro-Soviet governments. For example, when the U.S. sent money to Afghanistan, which as a result the groups began to fight back with the USSR, and finally the USSR gives up because they lose too many soldiers and too much money which they do not have to spend. In Nicaragua, a group called the Sandinistas had overthrown the democratic government. The Sandinistas were communist, therefore we didn't like them being with power. So Reagan sends money to this group called the Contra to take out the Sandinistas. Congress later banned this idea because they weren't too fond of it. Another example of the Reagan Doctrine was the U.S. sending money to direct groups instead of countries, which all takes place in Grenada. Reagan sends troops there and they defeat the Cuban and Grenadan communist groups. They had also established a democratic government. Reagan passed the Strategic Defense Initiative. This would develop weapons that would intercept incoming missiles. This was also called the SDI and nicknamed Star Wars. Reagan then meets with the USSR leader at peace summits. Reagan refused to halt Star Wars and later encouraged the leader of the USSR to tear down this wall, the Berlin Wall. The reason why Reagan refuses to halt Star Wars is because he's technically using it as a defense mechanism. Relations do get better because the INF Treaty was passed. The INF Treaty stood for Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. This treaty limits missiles that could potentially attack other countries. Here at the end, Gorbachev puts the political and economic reforms in the Soviet Union, but the USSR loses way too much money and becomes bankrupt and ends up collapsing. As a summary, Reagan enacted cuts in the domestic discretionary spending, cut taxes, and increased military spending, which contributed to the tripling of the federal debt. After leaving the White House in January 1989, Ronald Reagan and his wife returned to California, where they lived in Los Angeles. In 1994, Reagan revealed in a handwritten letter to the American people that he had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Nearly a decade later, on June 5, 2004, he died at his Los Angeles home at the age of 93, making him the nation's longest-lived president. In 2006, Gerald Ford surpassed him for this title. Reagan was given a state funeral in Washington, D.C., and later buried in grounds of his presidential library. Nancy Reagan died of heart failure in 2016 at the age of 94 and was buried alongside her husband.